Tyrone is going to help us, so if you can raise your hand, he will take the mic to you and you can ask your question. First of all, let's open this up by asking you guys, and maybe Andy and Del particularly, how did this whole thing come about? Andy, we know, a lot of people in this room know your story. You've been dealing with this subject matter for a good 18, maybe 20 years now. But at what point did you decide you have to get this on film and you have to get it out to a wider audience? What compelled you to do this?
Right, I suppose that, can you hear me? Is it working?
Yeah.
When my career changed course, I teamed up with Tommey and the Autism Media Channel, and our aim was to make serious documentaries about this issue. And in 2014, Brian Hooker contacted me and said there's an inside source at the CDC who is disclosing the fact that they've concealed data. And Brian had done a wonderful job at unraveling that mystery. We decided to make a documentary. And as it came together, I was at a fundraiser in Los Angeles, and there in the audience was Bigtree. Del was a producer from the Doctor's TV show. I'd come there, he came up to me afterwards and he said, Andy, I want to come to Austin, I want to see what you've got. He came to Austin, he looked at what we got, he then gave up his job at the Doctor's on the promise of nothing at all. And together we put together this story. So it's been a long time in the making, but I hope you'll agree that it was well worth putting together.
You, of course, had a very successful career as a producer on The Doctor. So when you talk to this guy, Andy Wakefield, what is it that motivated you to give up this job and to pursue this movie?
Well, first of all, it starts with what this story is about. The CDC whistleblower, this incredible data that he's given us. You know, it spent 7 years celebrating the best of what medicine had to offer. It also was known on The Doctors for doing difficult stories, glyphosate, Monsanto, things like that that were affecting public health. But when I met Andy and I went down to see this documentary he was working on, looking at the data, looking at these interviews, and looking at what Dr. Thompson was saying, I realized I was looking at the biggest story of my lifetime. When you think as a journalist or a filmmaker, you know, you sort of think about Watergate and you know what took place there, and you kind of wonder, I wonder if a story like that will ever happen in my lifetime. And I realized I was staring at that. I was staring at something so big and scary and daunting. But the truth is I had no choice. How do you walk away from what you just saw? I mean, what this scientist, the most important, you know, vaccine study, the one we've all been pointing to, saying vaccines are safe, and the top scientist involved in crunching the numbers on it comes out and says we're manipulating data in here, we're throwing things out. I guess I'm just surprised that we're the only ones telling this story. I don't know where the news media has been on it. I don't know how they held off for a year, and then when a congressman steps up and takes the same data we're looking at, and we were all in an editing bay the moment that happened, and said, oh my God, look at this, it's happening, it's happening. You know, Bill Posey's bringing this before the Congress. Certainly now the media will tell this story. We have a real congressman talking about a real CDC whistleblower, a decorated scientist that's at the CDC as we speak. You know, now it's got to be a story. Still no story. You know, as journalists, you know, this isn't a court of law. This is a film. We've made a movie about a very important story. As journalists, as filmmakers, what Andy's been doing all along is asking reasonable, appropriate questions based on what we've been told. That's what this film is doing. I can only, as a filmmaker, Andy, Polly, we can only ask those questions and ask that, you know, the society, our country, look into this matter and ask these same questions of our congressmen, of our government. And then you see the media that's come out against us saying, do not see this movie. Do not, you know, Tribeca, pull this down. I don't think we've ever seen a moment like this, that media is telling people to not see a movie they have not seen themselves. I mean, you know, I thought in order to be a film critic, you had to watch a movie to criticize, you know. But what's really at stake here is massive. It's the health of our children, it's the health of our future. But what we've seen over the last week calls into question, you know, if we can't ask these questions, then we really have to question the health of our democracy. And that's what I think we all have to do.
Holly, we've all seen your story here on screen tonight, and I want to thank you for that, for being brave enough to actually open yourself up. Tell us, how did you initially meet Andy Wakefield?
Oh, well, I met Andy years ago at the beginning of the GMC, and my husband actually suggested that I interviewed him for the Autism File magazine, and I didn't really want to, but he insisted that I did, and that was a long time ago, and time's moved on, and I just want to say, really, that was Billy's story, but there are countless other stories, and they're all very similar, but right now, as I speak, I have a friend whose adult child seizures all day. She stands over this child and she has no idea whether he's going to make it through the seizure. I have another friend whose adult child, smashes his head so violently that his head is so distorted, she doesn't know if he's going to make it. There is nothing pretty about a vaccine-injured child. And this has to stop. And this has to stop now. We cannot harm any more of our precious babies. So out there are more William Thompsons. There are people who know what it's doing to our children, and it has to stop now. They have to do the right thing now. And we have to stop any more children being damaged, and then, now we have to take care of the countless Billies out there that have no future, and psychotropic medicine and 4-point restraints is not the way for our children. This is a serious situation. We are supposed to love one another, not harm one another, and it has to stop now. No money is worth taking the life of a child like Billy. Billy could have had a chance in life to be whatever he could have been, and he doesn't now. He simply doesn't, just like all the other vaccine-damaged children, like Steve, like everything else. It is bleak and it is horrendous, and we have to stop this happening now.
It was your initial conversations with Dr. Thompson at the CDC that really paved the way for this story to be told and for this movie to be made. Ultimately, what was it like for you when you knew that it was going to go public? What was the feedback from Dr. Thompson?
I believe that Dr. Thompson, when he found out that the information was going public, was relieved and actually had a weight lifted off of his shoulders. And one of the things that he told me, and this is not in a conversation that I recorded, was, you know, I'm going to have to go through a few months of agony, granted, but that's nothing compared to the life sentence that children have and families have once their child has gone through a vaccine injury. And it's, you know, it does my heart good to see this information finally get out. The story that the media, even though we went public with the whistleblower story in August of 2014, there was such a media blackout, nobody would touch it. And if they did touch it, they would only touch the fact that I had a paper retracted over this whole issue. That's the only thing that they would touch. But having this movie come forward, and I am not in contact with Dr. Thompson. I think that if he was in contact with me, that would jeopardize his livelihood and his retirement and his family. But in seeing the film, I think that this is a film that Dr. Thompson would be pleased with.
One last question before we open it up to the audience. I'm sure most of you have been following what happened with Tribeca Film Festival. Certainly, we were disappointed at first when we found out that the film had been removed from the schedule, but I'm curious if any of you have had feedback from people you've talked to about that, and how do you feel about it now?
I can say that, you know, it was a real honor to be selected by Tribeca Film Festival. It's one of the greatest film festivals in the world. To be in communication, have the support of someone as brilliant and wonderful as Robert De Niro was a spectacular moment in time that we enjoyed for, you know, a couple of months. You know, what happened after that, yeah, we will never know. I wasn't in those rooms. I don't know what kind of pressure came down. I don't know where that pressure comes from. We've seen a lot of speculations in the news. But all I can say is that, you know, Robert De Niro is suffering the same life that Polly Tommey is and Brian Hooker. And I know that, you know, I think I speak for all of us, our hearts go out for him and all the families that have to deal with you know, an autistic child, a vaccine injured child. And, you know, I think my hopes are that certainly he and his wife and his family recover from this really awful event, and whoever put them up to it. And I hope the Tribeca Film Festival survives, because, you know, a lot of filmmakers have reached out to me and said, I'm never going to submit a film there again. It's a really sad day in film. You know, I left television, I left my job to make a film because this was the only place I thought we'd be allowed to do this anymore. I mean, the sponsors in television now, if you turn on your television and you watch your ad breaks, every single one of them is filled with pharmaceutical ads. You know, I remember 10 years ago, or, you know, a little bit longer, you'd sit in a doctor's office and you'd see the ads running on a screen. But we all now have that box in our house. And it's trying to convince us that we cannot live without pharmaceutical intervention. And that's a problem. It's a problem with television. I thought film was above that, and thank God for places like Angelika Film Festival. And other theaters that are reaching out to us, and I look forward to all the great theaters that will still stand up for truth, stand up for, you know, at least allowing us to tell our stories, whatever they may be. It's all about freedom of speech.
Thank you, Joe. When it got pulled, I said to the guys, you know, welcome to my world. It's like the weather, you know, you wait 5 minutes and it can be completely different. And then this happens, and you can't buy the kind of publicity that we got, not that you'd want most of it. But what the sadness for me, I suppose, is that we were never privileged to who said what organization, what criticisms or comments had been made that led to the decision to pull it. There was no transparency whatsoever, and that lack of due process is such a great shame. It's a great shame for all of us, for filmmakers, for parents, for the entire country. But nonetheless, I agree entirely with Del that my heart goes out to any parent affected by this, particularly when you're up against an organization that is thrusting quasi-science in your face when you have no expertise in that area, and it clearly causes panic. Anyway, we move on. The important thing to note is we will never walk away from this issue. We will never quit. We'll go to our graves fighting this fight because it is worth fighting. Nelson Mandela, at his trial before he was incarcerated in solitary confinement for 27 years, said some ideals are worth dying for. And your children are far more than just ideals, and they're most certainly worth dying for. So we continue.
Let's open it up to the audience. If you have a question, just raise your hand, and Tyrone will find you.
I'm an alternative medicine doctor. I want to thank you so much for the work you do and the courage and the temperament you do. Thank you.
So I was surprised by how much of the opposing viewpoints you had in the film. I was just wondering, from an editing perspective, why you chose not to include the retraction from the Lancet, and Brian Hooker, your paper was also retracted, so why that was omitted from the film, and just, editing choice, why you didn't respond to certain things like the General Medical Council finding that you, Andrew Wakefield, acted dishonestly and irresponsibly in the Lancet study. So if you can answer that, that would be great. Thanks.
First of all, trying to fit a gigantic story into 90 minutes. There was actually probably about a week before the final edit, we certainly had a part about Brian Hooker's paper being retracted. As many of these papers that do go through the science and do get published and then ultimately get retracted, it's amazing to me these journals can stand up for themselves after they accept a paper, go through peer review, and then suddenly get pressure and retract them. The fact that we give these papers any dignity anymore is surprising to me. I can only say that I left my job as a medical producer on a great show. Certainly when I saw this story, I had to investigate Andy Wakefield's story myself. It's a really long story to get into every detail you uncover and how ridiculous the accusations are against him. I'll just say that I'm proud to have made this movie with Andy Wakefield, a man who never gave up fighting for our children, and it's been a real honor to work with you, Andy.
I would imagine the person who said that, and I can't see, it's dark out there, but is a journalist, and I would throw the question back to you and say, sorry, a scientist. It was never, what was never reported in the media, and what you clearly don't know, therefore, and no fault of your own because the media ignored it, is that the decision of the General Medical Council was, for the first time it came before a proper judiciary, the English High Court, was completely overturned. The case against my colleague, John Walker Smith, at appeal was completely overturned. The judge was utterly dismissive of the General Medical Council. He said they were unfit to judge evidence, and worse, they were biased. He said their decision cannot stand, and I do not ever want to see this happen again. Okay? That is a fact.
The number one thing everyone in this theater can do right now to make a difference in this discussion is each one of you gets one of your friends to show up over this weekend to see this film. Everything in this world revolves around success, and theaters need to see success. This film being successful, as we have here today, there's plenty of shows now this weekend that the more success we have this weekend, the more other theaters around the country are going to say, this is a story people want to hear. Those theaters got filled. I want this story in my theater. So right now, what we've done is all we can do is make the best movie we could, giving the most honest depiction of the facts as you've seen them, the statements made by this CDC whistleblower, these wonderful parents that have suffered through this and shared their story in such a beautiful way. Please honor them, and please help us make this a viable film for theaters across America. Of course, beyond that, then it goes to video on demand and the success of it. And I think that many parents and people sitting, not sure where they stand right now are going to see this movie and realize, you know what? This can be done better. We are not, as we've said, you've just seen it. You've seen all the headlines. This is an anti-vaccine movie. This is not an anti-vaccine movie. This is a movie demanding that these vaccines be made safer. There's ways to do it. Why can't we have singular measles, single mumps, single rubella, What is the big deal? Why can't we do double-blind safety studies? Why aren't we doing long-term testing like every drug, like Viagra or anything else that we're giving our grandparents? Why aren't we giving our babies the same dignity? That's all we're asking for. It's very reasonable.
Yeah. Tell us about the testing, though, will you? Because that's something I don't think a lot of people understand.
Excuse me?
Tell us about the safety
The
testing.
blind testing, is that something that you can tell us more about? Because I don't think a lot of people understand how vaccines are tested versus other drugs.
Let me give you an example. Let's just take measles vaccine, live virus vaccine. The World Health Organization recommendations to the pharmaceutical industry for testing these vaccines before they are put into trial in children. They recommend that you take primates, non-human primates, monkeys, and that you take no fewer than 10 animals. You inject these animals with the virus for the vaccine, not the vaccine itself, but the virus of the vaccine. You don't inject them subcutaneously, you put the injection directly into the thalamus of the brain. You then observe these animals for neurological signs over the next 17 to 21 days, and then you terminate the animal and look at their brains under the microscope. If an animal dies in the first 48 hours, you can replace it in the study. It's not the vaccine's fault, it's the animal's fault for dying. If more than 20% of the animals die during that study, then you can quit the study and start all over again. It's the animal's fault, not the vaccine's fault. Now, there are no controls. There are no animals that have saline injected into their thalamus in place of the virus. That is the basis. After that has been done, then it is safe to go into children, for testing in children. Is that adequate? Does that even come close to being a scientific study? I could ask my colleague out in the audience. The answer is categorically no. It's just one example. I could go on. The testing of measles vaccine initially was done in children in hospitals like Willowbrook in New York State. It was done in children with cerebral palsy, children with congenital brain abnormalities, children who were profoundly mentally retarded and incapacitated. Why was it done in those children? Because it was easy to observe them, because they couldn't go anywhere. They were paralyzed, they were bedridden. That's why it was done in those children. Now, we could argue about the ethics of that till the end of recorded time, but in terms of vaccine safety testing, you are taking a population of people who are already brain damaged. And what you're looking for as an outcome, an adverse outcome of the vaccine, is some neurological injury. How can you extrapolate from that population of sadly damaged children to a population of healthy children? You can't. So on every level, ethical and practical, it fails the test. That is the basis of the measles vaccine. I think I don't need to say any more.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to have to make room for the next show pretty soon, but we've got time for one more question. So let's do one more question.
Has any presidential candidate taken a stand on this?
Clarify some things.
The question right here, though, was, has any presidential candidate taken a stand on this? I mean, I think we all are aware that Donald Trump, addressed this issue during one of the debates. I think what's interesting about it is when the question was posed to him by CNN, which is sponsored by...
Hold your finger. The question.
The first question was right down here, and we can go to the other question. But what I think is interesting
What was the question?
Oh,
what was it?
The question is, has a presidential candidate addressed this issue of vaccines and autism? The only candidate I know of is Donald Trump, but he also was supported in many ways by Rand Paul and Ben Carson, who both said in that same debate, though there's been many studies proving no connection, both Rand Paul and Ben Carson doctors said there's a growing belief amongst pediatricians that we're giving too many vaccines, too much vaccines all at one time. And a lot of people in this country are getting really tired of having the government decide what's best for their own children.
Okay, let's go back to
one question. Let him answer
here,
this question.
and then we'll wrap it up.
Sorry, quickly, what actually is the flaw in the study? I missed it in the movie, is that they changed the numbers in what way? That's the first question. So I can tell somebody what the flaw in the study is. And the second question is, are we seriously in this room, all these people, and the million people out there that have autistic children, dealing with a situation where the pharmaceutical industry insists that you get 3 vaccines at once at a young age, and that the world would come to an end if we waited until the kid was 4 or 5 and then gave them 1 vaccine at a time? That's what they're resisting? And why?
Just to handle the first question, the flaw in the DiStefano study is specifically, and there are several marked flaws, but the specific flaw around the African American cohort is that when they ran the entire sample, they saw an effect. They saw a very, very strong effect in African Americans that received the MMR vaccine on time versus those African Americans that received the MMR after 36 months of age. They subsequently saw an even stronger effect when they looked at African American males alone. They did not like that particular result, so they decided that they would kick individuals out of the study if they did not have a valid state of Georgia birth certificate. This was a study that looked specifically at individuals in metropolitan Atlanta. And what they found was when they kicked out the individuals that did not have a valid state of Georgia birth certificate, that they were able to reduce the statistical power of the sample. The sample became much smaller. It actually decreased its size by 40%. And although there was a positive risk, it was no longer statistically significant. And the way that they did that, the way that they made the relationship go away, and anybody that knows statistics and epidemiology, if you have a smaller sample size, then you lose statistical power. Numbers, large numbers give you more statistical power. So these CDC scientists knew that if they got a smaller sample size, that they could basically ignore any type of result as being not statistically significant. That's the first part. Anybody want to handle
the second part is they did something very similar with isolated autism, the children who were developmentally normal to 12 months of age, and then they decided to actually destroy the data so that there was no record that anyone could go back to check on those facts.
And you want to know, like, what was the motivation? You want to talk about the patent or the ownership of MMR versus single measles, mumps, rubella.
What is the motivation? What is the motivation for not? Okay, when this all happened, when this data came to light, the CDC had 2 choices. They had many choices, but the first choice they had was to say, right, we will now, in the interests of children, with an abundance of caution, we will delay the vaccine, just as you suggested, till after 3 years of age, particularly in these high-risk groups, until this is resolved scientifically. At the same time, we will conduct a bigger, larger study, a better study to determine whether we can replicate this finding in another population. They did neither of those 2 things that they should have done. What they did was to cheat and throw out the data. That's number one. Number 2 is, why do we not want to go back to single measles vaccines? Why would a company like Merck that makes the MMR withdraw the option of single measles vaccines unilaterally? Not a government decision. Merck made the decision to deprive parents in this country of the single vaccines by making MMR the only vaccine available. Why would they do that? It's a very interesting question that's currently under discussion and certainly being looked at in the courts. It came to light that Merck held the patent for the mumps vaccine. They were the only company in this country to have that. And they tried to prevail upon the CDC to introduce a mumps vaccine, and the CDC, just as the English health authority said, no, we don't need a mumps vaccine. It's a trivial disease, and it doesn't cost us anything. It's relatively harmless. We have no need for a mumps vaccine. And Merck, Maurice Hilleman, went state by state persuading state health officials to introduce the mumps vaccine until it got to the point where the CDC said, everybody's using it, so to hell with it. To hell with it. We might as well have a mumps vaccine. Merck then got the combined vaccine patent and cleaned up with a monopoly. So that is the basis of the science on which mandatory mumps vaccination was introduced into this country, on an oh to hell with it call by the CDC. That is another insider's information. So it really comes down to a commercial imperative on behalf of the major pharmaceutical industry to create a monopoly, in my opinion.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we do need to make room for the next audience. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. I want to thank Brian and Tommey and Dale and Randy for being here and you guys can tell the story and the wherewithal to stick with it. Thank you, everybody. Move us to the lobby, and our panelists will be out there to talk with you more if you'd like to ask them more questions. Thank you very much.
Work your left hand. Oh, I like where I'm set up. Thank you.